All right, get ready because today we're going deep, really deep into JavaScript prototypes and inheritance. I know, maybe not the most exciting words you've ever heard. Prototypes and inheritance. Sounds intense, right? But actually, stick with us. It's a really cool way to make your code reusable and way more efficient. It's like having a blueprint that lets you build amazing stuff without starting from zero every single time.
Yeah, and what's fascinating is how JavaScript does inheritance. It's different from a lot of other languages. It doesn't use traditional classes. Instead, it uses this clever prototype system.
So it's like JavaScript went its own way, made its own system.
Exactly, and that has some pretty interesting consequences, especially for how we think about structuring our code and organizing everything in JavaScript.
Okay, so let's break this down. What is prototypal inheritance exactly?
Well, at its core, prototypal inheritance is how objects in JavaScript inherit properties and methods from other objects. You can think of it like a family tree. You have your parents, grandparents, and so on, passing down traits and characteristics. In JavaScript, objects can inherit stuff, properties, and methods from their prototype ancestors, we can say.
Okay, yeah, I'm seeing the family resemblance here. So instead of defining the same things over and over again, like for every object, we can create a math template object, the prototype, and let other objects inherit from that.
Exactly. That master template idea is super powerful because it means we can reuse code a lot. We avoid repetition. It's like a family recipe book, right? Instead of everyone writing down the entire chocolate chip cookie recipe, you have one master recipe everyone can use.
That's a great analogy. I'm starting to get it. But how does this inheriting process actually work? I mean, JavaScript doesn't have actual family trees for the objects, does it?
Not literally printed out, no, but it has a really smart system for tracking those inheritance relationships. It uses something called the prototype chain.
Prototype chain. Sounds kind of mythical.
It might sound complex, but it's actually pretty simple. Imagine an object that represents a dog, and you want to know if that dog can bark. JavaScript doesn't just look at the dog object itself, it goes on a search up the prototype chain.
A treasure hunt for the bark property.
Exactly. So first, it checks the dog object itself for that bark property. If it's not there, it goes up to the dog's prototype. Let's say that's a generic animal prototype. And if bark is defined in the animal prototype, then JavaScript knows, okay, our dog can bark.
So it's like an order of searching. If the object doesn't have a certain property, it checks its prototype, and if that doesn't have it, it goes up to that prototype's prototype, and so on and so on. A chain of inheritance.
You got it. And this chain is key. It lets us reuse code efficiently and keep everything organized. We don't need to define the same properties and methods for every single object. We can just define them once in a prototype and let everything inherit from there.
Okay, I really see how this makes code so much cleaner, more manageable too. But how does this actually work under the hood? What connects everything?
Two main things, the prototype property and the proto link. Every function in JavaScript has a special property called prototype. This property points to an object, and that object is basically the prototype for all objects created using that function.
So if we have a function called, let's say, dog, then dog.prototype points to an object. That object's like the blueprint for all the dog objects we create.
Exactly. Now, every object in JavaScript also has this hidden property. It's called proto, and this property is what creates that link in the chain. It points to the prototype of the object that it came from.
So if we create a dog object using that dog function, the dog.proto would point back to that dog.prototype.
You're exactly right. And through these prototype properties and proto links, JavaScript creates this whole web of inheritance relationships.
It's like this whole hidden world inside JavaScript.
Yep.
Can we see a real code example to make this super clear?
Absolutely. Let's take a simple person object. Imagine this code. We have a function called person, takes a name, assigns it to the name property of the object. Then we add a greet function to the person.prototype object.
So if I'm following you, when we create person1 using new person with the name Alice, that person1 object doesn't actually have the greet method itself, right?
Right.
But it can still access it through that prototype chain.
Exactly. That's where the prototype magic happens.
Wow, so we can actually see this code reuse in action.
Yeah.
This is incredible. I'm really seeing how much cleaner and efficient prototypes make our code.
And this is just the beginning. Prototypes are fundamental to JavaScript. They play a huge role in so many things, like constructor functions and even ES6 classes.
Okay, well, slow down. Let's unpack these one at a time. My programmer brain is already buzzing. I think we need a little break to let everything sink in.
Good idea. These concepts can be pretty dense. Gotta give them time to digest.
All right, we'll be back in a bit. Then we'll be exploring constructor functions in JavaScript. We'll see how they fit into this whole prototype and inheritance picture.
Stay tuned, folks. This JavaScript journey is just getting started.
I'm still amazed by these prototypes. It's like we found a secret code to make coding better.
Yeah, prototypes can really change how you write JavaScript. But there's another piece to this.
Another piece. You've got my attention. Are you talking about constructor functions?
Exactly. They're like special factories for making objects with shared characteristics.
Okay, that sounds interesting. Tell me more.
Imagine a car factory, right? You wouldn't build each car from scratch. You'd have a blueprint. That outlines the car's basic structure and features. Constructor functions in JavaScript, they're like those blueprints.
So it's a set of instructions
Mm-hmm.
for making objects of a specific type.
Exactly. Say you want to make a bunch of car objects in your code. Instead of manually defining properties like brand, model, color for each one, you can define a car constructor function to do it for you.
That's definitely more efficient. Can we see an example?
Of course. Here's a car constructor function. It takes the brand, model, and color as arguments. And inside the function, these values are assigned to the this keyword, which represents the object being created.
Okay, so we have the car constructor function. It takes the brand, model, and color. And we see this.brand, this.model, this.color. This is important, right?
Yes. And notice how we've added a drive method to the car.prototype object. This means any car object created using our car constructor automatically gets that drive method.
So it all connects back to prototypes. This is where that code reuse happens.
Exactly. By defining drive on the prototype, every car object can use it. We don't have to define it again and again for each object.
So if I create a blue Honda Civic, it can drive too, because of that drive method on the prototype.
Precisely. It applies to any method or property we define on the prototype.
It's like giving all our cars special abilities.
And here's where it gets even more exciting. We can actually extend objects by adding new properties or methods to their prototypes, even after the objects have been created.
Wait, are you saying we can change the blueprint after the cars are built?
That's exactly what I'm saying. JavaScript lets us dynamically modify prototypes.
That's crazy. Show me an example.
Let's add a new method to our car prototype. We'll call it honk. Now, every car object, even the ones we made before, will have this honk method.
Amazing. Like an instant upgrade.
But with great power comes great responsibility, right? We have to be careful when modifying prototypes, especially built-in ones like those for arrays or strings. Changing those can have big consequences for your whole code base.
It's like having the power to change the fundamentals of JavaScript.
Exactly. Best to be cautious and focus on extending your own custom prototypes.
Don't mess with the built-in ones. Got it.
Yeah.
This has been so eye-opening. I'm starting to see how everything fits together in JavaScript. But I think there's one more piece of the puzzle we need to talk about.
You're right. We've talked about prototypes and constructor functions. But there's a newer way to do inheritance in JavaScript.
You're talking about ES6 classes, right? I've heard about them.
Yeah, they're a great addition to the language. The syntax is more familiar if you're coming from other object-oriented languages, but behind the scenes, they're still based on prototypes.
So it's like a new look for the same engine.
That's a good way to put it. ES6 classes provide a more structured and maybe a more intuitive way to define objects and inheritance.
This is getting better and better. I can't wait to dive into ES6 classes and see how they relate to prototypes.
Let's do it. We'll explore the world of ES6 classes and how they improve our JavaScript coding experience.
All right, ES6 classes. Let's do this. I'm ready to see how they make inheritance easier.
You'll like them. ES6 classes, they bring in a syntax that's more like traditional object-oriented programming, like JavaScript got a fresh coat of paint, but kept its heart the same.
A fresh coat of paint. So does this mean I can finally use words like extends and super without confusing JavaScript?
Yes, exactly. ES6 classes bring in those familiar keywords. Let's use our animal examples again to see how it works.
Okay, animal analogies are always good.
Let's say we have a dog class that inherits from an animal class. Here's the ES6 class way to do that. We have our animal class, constructor, and a speak method.
And then dog, using extends to show it inherits from animal.
Right. And see that super name in the dog constructor, that's how we call the parent class constructor, the animal one. Make sure the name property is set up right.
So super connects the child class to the parent class.
You got it. And we've also overridden the speak method in dog to make it more specific.
This is really cool. The code is so much easier to read. It's more structured with ES6 classes. But you said before it's still prototypes behind the scenes.
That's important to remember. ES6 classes make the syntax nicer, but under the hood, it's still the prototype chain that does all the work for inheritance and finding properties.
So should I just forget about prototypes and only use ES6 classes?
Not quite. ES6 classes are great, but understanding prototypes is still really important if you want to master JavaScript. It gives you a deeper understanding of how inheritance actually works. It's like knowing how a car engine works, even if you drive an automatic.
I get it. So prototypes are still relevant even with ES6 classes.
Definitely. And sometimes you really need to understand prototypes. Like if you need to change how objects behave on the fly, or if you're working with old code that was written before ES6 classes.
Okay, I'm convinced. Prototypes are important. But now that we have all these tools for inheritance in JavaScript, what are the best ways to use them?
Good question. Keep it simple. Don't create these huge, complicated inheritance hierarchies. It can get really hard to manage. We call that spaghetti code.
Spaghetti code sounds messy.
It is. Keep your inheritance relationships straightforward. And don't be afraid to use other options like composition.
Oh, is this-
Yeah, it's a way of building objects by combining smaller, independent parts. Think of it like building with Legos. You put together different bricks instead of trying to carve something complex from one big block.
That makes sense.
Right. So instead of always using inheritance to make complex objects, sometimes it's better to combine simpler objects. It gives you more flexibility. Choose the right tool for the job. Sometimes it's inheritance, sometimes it's composition.
This has been an amazing deep dive. I really understand JavaScript prototypes and inheritance now.
Glad to hear it. And remember, understanding these concepts is a big step toward becoming a better JavaScript developer.
Absolutely.
So keep experimenting with your code, keep learning, and keep pushing the boundaries of what you can do with JavaScript.
That's great advice. Till next time, happy coding, everyone.